Look at there. I'm an Aggie. That explains it, okay? By the way, I'm seeing my slides up there. So if I point at that slide up there, you just remind me you're actually watching these things up here, okay? It's been a hard year for hospitality-based ministries. And so as I'm looking out here, first of all, let me say that I'm impressed you have a healthy church. Now, most of the health has just left the room, apparently, to go memorize verses. But I grew up collecting rocks. How many of you have a rock collection? Excellent. How many of you had a rock collection, your mom got rid of it? Okay, that happened to me too. But I knew at an early age that I was going to study geology, and I actually got an undergraduate and a graduate degree at Texas A&M, and the Lord gave me 14 years in the industry before he gave me my real job, and as summer camp director at Frontier Camp, and now as the executive director. And what we want to do is, well, I'll show it to you this way. Our purpose is to make disciples of Jesus by sharing God's word in his creation. That's our mission. And so we do that primarily by running summer camps, and we offer junior camps for 7 to 13-year-olds, teen weeks for 13 to 17-year-olds, and we have those youth for a week. And that's the overt ministry. But we really have a bigger impact on our staff because we have them for 11 weeks or 13 weeks. Right, Langston? Yeah. So, and Justin, where did Justin go? He left. That's right. He told me he was going to leave. So, and then the other thing that we offer as a ministry is retreats. And that's been the tough thing, by the way. I want to commend your men for coming out in the fall and having a retreat at Frontier Camp, because I think y'all were the only group we had that fall. I'm exaggerating a little bit, but yeah, it was wonderful to serve you, and we look forward to serving you again. So let's launch into the topic of today, which is an event that changed the course of the planet in terms of the way it looks today, okay? And it also changed the course of humanity, because in it we have a event where God shows how much he hates sin and how holy he is. So let's start and just look at Genesis chapter 6 with me, if you'll turn there. Starting in verse 5, we're just going to take a running start into this. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on earth, and he was grieved in his heart. By the way, I'll submit to you that that's probably one of the saddest verses in our scripture. God was sorry that he had made man. This is a huge, huge change from God looking at his creation saying, it is good. Now he's grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I've created from the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things to the birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. These are the records of the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his time. Noah walked with God. And so this starts the narrative, which I'm going to submit to you, that in the context of Genesis 1 through 11 is historical narrative. Now, there are people who will quibble with that. And I'm just going to straight up tell you that I'm coming at the text as being a plain, literal, normal interpretation, the way that you would read a historical account. Okay? And I'll tell you this as well. When I was a junior at Texas A&M, or actually I was a sophomore, there was an invited lecture series. We called them brown bags. How many of you know what brown bags are? Okay, you they're happen over lunch. You come and sit down, and they're too cheap to actually furnish the meal. And so you have to bring your own brown bag. And they bring in a visiting guest lecturer. And at this point, it was a geologist from the Vicksburg Experiment Station, which is Army Corps of Engineers. And his talk was titled, Flood Myths of the World. So I was pretty intrigued. And I went and got my little brown bag out and listened to his lecture. And he kind of was detailing the different kind of geological, philosophical treatments that different cultures in the ancient world had. And he noted that all of them had different flood myths. And then up flashed a slide, and he said, oh, and there's the flood myth in Genesis. And I was like, wait a minute. Flood myth? Genesis? Those two words, you put them together. And he said, basically, if you believe in a global flood that literally happened, you're believing in a fairy tale. Okay? And so I would tell you that we have to wrestle with that, because a large majority, in fact, I would say the vast majority of scholars and academics that deal with the Old Testament would tell you that the flood is a myth. Okay? So let's take a look. Turn one page over, and let's look at the text here in chapter 7. We're going to just kind of cover some verses real quick here, and then we're going to launch into the thought process of dealing with the flood. Then the Lord said to Noah, enter the ark, you and all your household, for you alone I have seen to be righteous before me in this time. By the way, for the kids in here, was Noah perfect? No, he wasn't, was he? We're all sinners, and Noah had a sin nature like we did. So what was the difference between Noah and his neighbors in a nutshell? Noah believed God. Think about that for a second. Noah was the only person, Noah and his family were the only people left on the face of the planet that believed God and took him at his word. Do you know how we know that? Because they're the only ones that got on the ark. Peter tells us that Noah went around as a preacher of righteousness, and he invited everyone on the ark. Did they come? They did not. Why not? Unbelief. So think about the context here. Not only was the heart of man focused on evil continually, but everyone outside of Noah's family completely disregarded the fact that there was a God and that he had expectations. And so when Noah walked around and said, there's a flood coming, they laughed at him. Wow. You shall take with you every clean animal by sevens, a male and his female, and of the animals that are not clean, 2, a male and his female. Also the birds of the sky by sevens, male and female, to keep offspring alive on the face of all of the earth. For after 7 more days I will send rain on the earth, 40 days and 40 nights, and I will blot out from the face of the land every living thing that I have made. Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. Note there in verse 4, what is God promising to do? What is he going to do? He's going to blot out all the animals in the Mesopotamian valley. No. Every living thing that I have made. So, now going on to verse 11. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month, on the same day, all of the fountains of the great deep, not just some of them, but all of them, burst open, and the floodgates of the sky were opened, and the rain fell upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Now, here's a question for you. How long was the flood? Well, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights, right? But just because the rain stopped doesn't mean the water was like, went away, right? Okay? So if you continue on in verse 17, then the flood came on the earth for 40 days, And the water increased and lifted up the ark so that it rose above the earth. And the water prevailed and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the surface of the water. By the way, this word ark is in the Hebrew, it's tiva. It just means big box. Okay? It's the same word that's described, that is used to describe the little basket that Moses was put in to float down the Nile River. Okay? Ark. It's not a big tugboat. By the way, just as a little aside, I think we do a disservice to our kids when we show them kind of the normal standard cartoon Noah's Ark. Y'all have seen them, right? The picture books that show the little tugboat with this old guy in a gray beard with this little hook, and the monkeys are swinging off the hook, and the giraffes have their heads stuck out the portholes, and it looks like a big giant pleasure cruise on a little boat. Okay? And then we decorate our nurseries with Noah's Ark wallpaper. That's kind of different when you think about it. Because everything died that was outside of the ark, that had the breath of air, the breath of life in its nostrils. By the way, this is another thing that I want to point out. In the text here, what kind of animals is Noah bringing on the ark? Land animals and birds. Unfortunately, that included the insects. But did Noah have sharks on his ark? No, he did not. Okay? So the animals that lived in the water stayed in the water. Okay? And they had to survive. So, the water, this is verse 19. The water prevailed more and more upon the earth, so that all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. Notice the words there, so that all of the high mountains everywhere under the heavens were covered. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered. Now, think about this. This is written by Moses, okay? Conservative scholarship holds that this is Moses writing, but he's reporting on something that was recorded long before Moses was alive. Okay? So this is an eyewitness account from Noah. So how do we know that Noah knew that the water was 15 cubits above the highest mountains? Anybody here like a sailor or work around boats? What? Anybody go duck hunting in the shallow parts of lake or rivers? Anybody? Yes. Okay, thank you. So what are you worried about if you're taking a boat in the shallow water? There's a technical term for this. It's called draft. Do you all know what the draft of a boat is? It's how it sinks, how far it sinks down. Okay? So I would submit to you that Noah knew that the water was 15 cubits over the mountains because that was the draft of the ark. And he wasn't hidden anything. Okay? So, one of the things that I want to point out here in making that observation is that there are a lot of different ark stories in different cultures across our big blue marble of the planet. There's the Gilgamesh epic, you may have heard of that. There are other accounts of global floods, and when you look at them in juxtaposition to the story that we have here in Genesis, the factual account, you see that there's been some transmission, and there's been some telegraph errors. Have y'all ever played telegraph or telephone, where you whisper something into someone's ear and you pass it down at the end, you have a big laugh at what it became? Okay? So in the Gilgamesh epic, the ark is described as a cube. That's 5 times larger than the ark that's described here in the text. So think about that for a second. A cube with a bunch of animals in it. And a cube is not very stable in the water, is it? Can you imagine it rolling along with the elephants and the rhinoceroses? Yeah. So, yes, sir.
Sorry to interrupt, but I gotta say.
Go ahead.
Just so everybody can kind of get their head around this, I actually pasted off as best as I could at one point, and the length of the arc was roughly from the road out here to the garage of the Elm House.
Yeah.
That's roughly the length of the arc.
if you want to go experience what the ark might have looked like and in its true dimensions, in its true material, go see the Ark Encounter in Kentucky. I have, and I've spent not enough time there. I'm going back. So, all right. So let's keep going. The water prevailed 15 cubits higher, and the mountains were covered, and all the flesh that moved on the earth perished, the birds and the cattle and the beasts and every swarming thing that swarms upon the earth, and all of mankind. All that was on the dry land, all those whose nostrils were the breath of life, of the spirit of life, died. Okay? So do you see the totality there? Okay, are you catching kind of what God is trying to say here? Thus he blotted out every living thing that was upon the face of the land, from man to animals to creeping things and to the birds of the sky, and they were blotted out from the earth. And only Noah was left, together with those that were with him in the ark. The water prevailed on the earth 150 days. So the peak of the flood is at 150 days. It is 375 days before Noah gets to get back out of the ark. Is that a pleasure cruise? Over a year long. Okay. So, when you're looking at this account, there are three views that are taken in kind of, characterizing it in three views. For those who take this account and say, okay, there's some worth in this. It's more than a fairy tale. It is a morality tale. What they're going to tell you, it's symbolic. It's non-literal, non-historical. Didn't happen, but it has something to teach us theologically. This is liberal scholarship here, okay? Then there are those who treat the text a little bit more reverently, and they say, okay, it is a factual account, but the flood that's being described is local, okay? And then there's the traditional view, which I hold to, and that is that we had a global flood. Now, when I approached that professor and I asked, so why is there no room for interpretation that says the flood could have been global? And he said, there's no geological evidence for it. Okay? And we need to back up for a second and say, okay, so there's these three views. Why does it matter? What? And by the way, let me quickly add here, there's two things I want you to come away with. Number one is this is not a salvation issue, okay? I know of many fine Christian scientists who do not hold to a young earth like I do. Some of them are theistic evolutionists. Some of them are just old earth creationists. And they're smart, thinking, genuine believers, okay? So this is not a salvation issue, but it is a scriptural authority issue, okay? The second thing I want you to come away with here is that when it comes to scientific evidence and scientific thought in terms of the text, there's no such thing as a magic bullet, okay? I'm not going to prove today to you beyond a shadow of a doubt that the flood is global, okay, in a scientific way. What I'm going to tell you is that there's evidence, okay, and that the evidence is the evidence whether you are an evolutionist, whether you're a theistic evolutionist, whether you're a creationist, old earth or young earth, everyone has the same evidence. So the evidence does not actually talk. The evidence in terms of extra-biblical evidence now, and primarily the geological landscape of the planet. Everyone has the same evidence. They all have the same fossils to look at. They all have the same landforms to look at. What makes the difference in the interpretation is the starting point, the software that you're running in your head, okay? So I can look at a fossil and say, flood, and somebody else can look at the fossil and say, oh, millions of years, okay? So at the end of the day, it's your starting point, and what determines your starting point? It's a faith, okay? What I'm going to tell you, and what I want you to come away with is that if you are a believer and you believe in a normal, plain, literal reading of the text, that you can come away with a consistent worldview that says that, yes, God did actually flood the earth, and this is a good interpretation, and it's logical and consistent and hangs together. Okay? So your faith is reasonable. But in order for you to hold on to something like this, at the end of the day, it's faith. And by the way, everyone has that same starting point. My good friends who are agnostic or atheists, there are very few atheists, by the way. Most atheists will rail against God, which tells you that they're really agnostic. Okay? Because if they were truly atheist, they wouldn't care, right? Atheist means no God, but yet they have a big problem with God. So, but at the end of the day, a lot of my agnostic friends will not admit that what they hold as fact is actually faith. Okay? I'm just straight up telling you, I have a faith. They have a faith, and if they agree to that, then we have a level playing field to discuss that. Okay. All right? So, evangelism goes hand in hand with apologetics, and being able to defend your faith means that you need to have a viable explanation for what you see and a good interpretation for matching what the text says with what you see in the world around you. And what we're finding out is that churches, by and large, are not actually addressing this issue in a way that is intellectually satisfying. And so as our youth are graduating and leaving and going into college, they're having shipwrecks. Okay? Their draft is not large enough to avoid the mountain tops. And so they're getting wrecked and they're leaving. 2/3 of the youth leaving churches like this one are abandoning or walking away from their faith, many of them not to return. So is this an important issue? Do we need to be able to say, hey, you do not need to check your brain at the door to come into church. You can be a believing, thinking Christian scientist and deal correctly with the text in a way that's not just intelligent, but that is also maintains the integrity of the words on the page. Okay? So, let's talk about a local flood. Why do people, why is there this push to make the flood local? Well, I've already told you, because when you look out at the world through the glasses of secular geology, the conclusion is there's no evidence for a global flood. Okay? And so you read things like this: the stratigraphy of some of the Mesopotamian flood deposits, literature pertaining to Gilgamesh and the ancient Sumerian cities, the Near Eastern setting of the biblical account, and obvious affinities of the biblical and Mesopotamian flood traditions would all converge to suggest that there may well have been a catastrophic deluge in the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys that severely disrupted the civilization of that area. A civilization that represented the world to the biblical writer, and that this may be what the biblical story is all about. Okay? So primarily people abandoned the global flood because they didn't see geological evidence for a global flood. And so when in 1928 and 29 in which is a great word, you can say I think Russell flew over in the Iraqi war, which is kind of seen as the cradle of human civilization, first kind of big cities in he discovered this silt deposit. It was about 5.5 feet thick, and he said, voila, I've found evidence for the flood. Okay? By the way, this is not the only time that someone says, whoa, I found evidence for the flood described in the Bible. The guy that discovered the Titanic put on a huge, what do you call those things? A documentary on the Discovery Channel about discovering flood deposits in the Black Sea and called that the biblical flood. Okay? And so what we have here is scientists who say, okay, I'm gonna look for the flood, I'm gonna look for flood deposits and I'm looking for, oh, look at this, a 6-foot thick mud layer, that must be the flood described in the Bible. Now, as a scientist, as a geologist, that's not really that intellectually satisfying. Okay? Thinking about a flood that inundated the entire world, destroyed everything, and it left a 6-foot mud layer? I'm going to submit to you that most people who hold to a local flood do so because of scientific problems, not because of the text. Okay? So what are some of the scientific problems with a local flood? Well, so I got this off of a website called Biologos. Okay? They're theistic evolutionists. They love the Lord, but they think that God created through evolution, and they don't believe in a global flood. And so here are the reasons why. First of all, a universal flood would have changed the topography of the land. Yes. Okay? So actually, we don't have a problem with that statement, and I'm not sure why they put it up there. Okay? But they do. Second, it would require an inordinate amount of water to flood the entire earth. All right, so just as an aside, real quick, when you look at the world from outer space, what do you call it? The big blue marble. Why? Because 70% of the Earth's surface is still covered in water. Okay? Think about that for a second, and we'll keep going. There's no way that 2 million known species of animals could fit on the ark. Not to mention the estimated 10 to 100 million species yet to be discovered. Now, is that a fair argument? Somebody in the audience, tell me what's wrong with that argument. Yes, exactly. Species is a human invention. It's not a God definition. In fact, we still have problems in biology trying to determine exactly what a species is. So if it's undefined in human minds, do you think God was relegated to using a human definition, a biological definition of species? He says, oh my word, I just can't make an ark. Okay? So if you go to the kind, which is probably somewhere in the genus level, okay, do y'all remember having to memorize that great, what is it? King Philip came over from Great Spain, right? Kingdom, phylum, class, yeah, came over from Great Spain. So in the genus level, Answers in Genesis, which is a great apologetics ministry, and if you have questions, you can go to their website, answersingenesis.org, and they have wonderful scientific research on kind of how many animals they think were on the ark, and they're saying now it's probably about 6,000. Okay? And by the way, the ark had enough capacity to contain about 500 standard-sized rail cars in volume. So think about that for a second. A train that's 500 cars. Do y'all sit at railroad crossings counting cars as they go by? Okay. What's the longest train you've seen? 150 cars. That's a long train. You're standing there counting for a long time. Think 5 times that. That's the capacity of the ark. Okay. And so if you calculate how much food you need, how much water you need, how many space for each animal, you come up with a deck area that leaves 1/4 of that space available for humans. Okay? So kind of a straw man there. And then finally, the migration of animals across mountains and oceans is quite difficult to explain. Well, if it's difficult to explain for the flood, then how do we explain it for evolution? Okay. So here's the problem. And I'll just be honest, when I graduated A&M, I was an old earth geologist, because the glasses that my professors fit on my face was to interpret the world around me using what is called the principle of uniformitarianism. I'm not going to get into that. That's another talk today, for another day. Okay? But basically what it says is you have to use natural processes that are occurring today to interpret the rock record around you. And that was the glasses that were fit on my face, so that when I looked out, I looked at the world through this long, uniform processes type of thing. So if I saw sandstone, I was thinking, okay, that's a beach. It takes a long time to accumulate a beach, so that must have taken a long time to accumulate. Okay? And so what I was taught was to take scientific philosophy and then look at the text through those glasses. Do you see a problem with that? Okay? Because what that did is it put me in authority over the text. And so when you approach the text that way, what you're trying to do is you take fallible thoughts of man and you shoehorn them into the text, and then you're trying to do some mental gymnastics with the words to try to make it fit whatever the prevailing wind of science is at that moment. Okay? So, what actually happens here? Well, the reason that I led you through the verses that I led you through is because I want you to get the idea that God said that he flooded the entire earth. And not only is it in the Old Testament here in the text, but it's also in the New Testament. The Lord himself says that they were all taken away. They were giving in marriage, right? And feasting, and then they all were taken away. So either you are left with the fact that after Adam and Eve proliferated outside of the Garden of Eden, and mankind over 1,500 years or so are populating the world, that they all stayed in this little valley. Okay? And if you have a universal judgment that kills all life, then all life has to be local. Okay? And that just doesn't make sense in terms of what we know about people or animals. Okay? And so, in terms of the context here, there are places where the text uses the words the earth or all the earth to point to just a particular spot. Kind of the way we use English sometimes, and we are all inclusive when we really just mean a certain locality. But in the terms of context here, God says that all men were evil, and the thoughts, intent of their heart were evil all the time, okay? And only Noah was righteous. So that context with the context of Genesis 1, where man is given stewardship of the earth, okay, not just over the local Mesopotamian valley, and the context of the universal dispersion, which happens after the flood, we all then get this impression that the text is teaching us that the flood was global, okay? And the promise not to flood the earth again that's given to both man and the animals with the rainbow sign, that is a global promise, okay? So if that's not a global promise for a global flood, then God has broken his promise a lot. Consider Harvey, right? What happened in Houston? So, here are some other questions that you can think of. If the flood was local, why did Noah have to build a huge big ark? Why didn't he just send people over to the next valley, right? Animals could have migrated away from the area, especially when it starts flooding, right? What are the animals going to do? They're going to seek high ground. And by the way, today you can go to Glen Rose and to the Dinosaur Valley State Park, and you can see dinosaur tracks there. And there's all these stories about, how the dinosaur tracks were made and then buried over a long period of time. Any hunters in here? How long do animals' tracks stay pristine in an environment? Yeah, okay? So you can already discount the geologic signs there by like, well, that doesn't make any sense, okay? And they're all going in the same direction, and topographically, if you map it out, they're all headed toward high ground. Why put birds on the ark? All right, so I kid you not, I actually went to a website of a geologist who's an old earth geologist who argues for a local flood, and he has an answer for that. Because birds don't fly in the rain. Okay, that's a geologist who's never been duck hunting. The best duck hunting I've had is when it's deluging. Okay, so how could the waters rise 15 cubits above the mountaintops? And what about God's promise not to flood the earth? And by the way, why did the flood take a year if it was local? Right? Is that what happened? That's a little bit more miraculous than just a global flood. So let's then just delve real quickly into the geological evidence for a flood, okay? Because there is. And by the way, just kind of closing the text chapter on what the text actually says. Liberal scholarship, the ones who fall in that first category that believe that the flood is just symbolic, take the flood story as being global. Okay? Do y'all get that? In other words, if you come at the text and you say, well, I'm going to read the words, I'm going to see what they mean, and to me they have no meaning, they're just symbolic, but the words mean global flood. That's where they end up. Okay? So, let's talk about what we've already mentioned, and that is that there are other flood stories and cultures all around. The little dots, the measles on the slide, show where there are, what cultures have flood stories in their oral tradition. It's a lot, isn't it? Okay, does that look global to you? It's global, yeah. That has to do with the dispersion of mankind globally after a flood. Here are some things that on the left side there, you can see some of the different characteristics of those flood traditions, and almost all of them are most of them are destruction by water, and most of them have humans saved, and most of them have animals saved. Okay. By the way, this is interesting. If you ever want to be fascinated by language, Google Proto-Chinese hieroglyphics, okay? So the Chinese write in pictures, and if you look at the beginning of their language, the Proto-Chinese hieroglyphics, the words that they use for things like mountain have a boat with 8 people in it in the picture. Go, do some research on your own. You can see that the Chinese language contains a visual record of the flood, okay, and some other biblical truths as well. So, in terms of the geology, when you look at the initiation of the flood, as a geologist, I see much more than a meteorological event. I see an earth-shattering event, the fountains of the great deep. That's plate tectonics, okay? And so if you go back into chapter 1 and look at the creation of the dry land, what it says in chapter 1, verse 6 is that, or it's not 6, but verse 6 of chapter 1. Verse 9, God says, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place. So by inference, if the waters are gathered into one place, where's the land? In another place. One place for water, one place for land. What do scientists call that one place for land? Pangea. Okay? So I'm going to submit to you as a geologist that I believe that when Noah got into the ark, he was on one continent. Okay? And that this great fountains of the deep involved not only plate tectonics, but a lot of volcanism. And so the windows of heaven, one of the big skeptical things about the global flood is, well, how do you sustain a rainstorm for 40 days and 40 nights? Okay? But if God initiated the breaking up of Pangea at the beginning of the flood, okay, think about this as the earth has got this crust that moves in plates, right? And the plates are now breaking apart, and the continents are going to raft into place during the course of the flood from where they were to where they are now. That's going to involve a lot of opening up of the ocean crust, and magma is coming up. Hot, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. What happens to water when it hits that kind of magma? It flashes to steam. And so mathematical models show that steam jets erupting at the plate boundaries must have jetted water 80 miles into the air. Okay? So way up into the stratosphere, sustaining rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Isn't that cool? Okay? Now, this is real quickly here on plate tectonics. This is Pangea breaking apart. And this is modeled by a Christian geophysicist. He was blessed to be, okay, so when I was in my geology classes, I took a graduate level plate tectonics class, and one of the big problems with plate tectonics was they didn't know how it worked, okay? Think of this. You have this really plastic mantle, and then you have this really hard crust. It's kind of like putting hot oatmeal, and then you have this like for lack of a better term, a piece of American Swiss cheese on top of the hot oatmeal, okay? So how do you move that? How do you drag that along without it just completely cracking apart or pulling or, you know? Is it little men down there pulling on the continents? How does it, okay, you want to know their best explanation right now? Convection currents. Kind of like when you boil water, you know how it bubbles? That must be what's happening in the mantle, and that's what made the plates move. From a crustal dynamic type of analysis, that's weak. Really, really weak. So what Dr. John Baumgartner did was he actually developed a numerical method that captured the deformation of olivine. Okay, I'm getting into the really thin branches with you guys. Olivine is the dominant mineral in the subsurface, and it has a really weird behavior in terms of its breaking and its plastic behavior and its ductile behavior. And it was really hard to model that because when you model numerically, computers don't like things to change really, really fast. They just blow apart. Have you ever had a computer just go, I can't do this? You've all experienced that, right? Okay? Well, he figured out how to do that with a Chinese grad student, and he built the very first crustal model. And by the way, this is in the secular world, this is the only model to date that can actually accurately model crustal motion. And guess what he found? It's density driven. The plates sink into the mantle under gravity's force, and that happens really rapidly. So look at this. Here is, I'm going to try to use a laser pointer. There we go, without flashing anybody's eyes. That's the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, Atlantic opening up. Okay, there's the proto-Atlantic at 15 days. Look at that. This is a mathematical model, guys and gals. Okay, this is science. And what it's showing you, in a matter of 5 days, the ocean has opened up significantly. Now, geologists will tell you that the plates right now are moving at the rate that your fingernail grows. So think about that. If the east coast of North America was once up against France and Spain, and it moved at the rate your fingernail grows, the Atlantic Ocean took a long time to open up. Okay, everybody get that? Okay? But who's to say that that really was the rate? If you're a cub reporter and I'm your editor and I send you out to a train wreck between a train and a semi, and you approach the scene and you see a hubcap rolling around at 1 mile an hour, and you write down in your little reporter's notebook that you're going to put online, you say, this was a really slow wreck, 1 mile per hour. What am I going to do as your editor? I'm going to fire you, right? So here we come on scene saying, oh, the plates are now moving at the rate of your fingernail, so we're going to extrapolate that over 135 million years. For real? It happened fast during the flood. Is there evidence for that? Yes. Seismic tomography, which is a fancy word for imaging using earthquake waves, shows us that we have cool regions of mantle, or in the mantle of ocean crust. So if the earth were really, really old and plate tectonics happened slowly, you would have thought that those plates would have assumed the temperature of the mantle around them by now, but they haven't. They're still there, and they can be imaged as cool regions in the middle of a hot mantle. That's what this little picture shows you. That should not exist if the earth were not young. I've already told you where the water went, okay? So bear with me here. I know it's getting a little late, okay? But think about this. The Pangea setting, the ocean basins were not as deep, and the mountains were not as high. So Mount Everest didn't have to be covered because Mount Everest was actually a result of a collision between two plates. Very rapid uplifting. That's why the ranges still look as sharp as they do. Okay? So from a geologic standpoint, the earth looks young when you look at mountain ranges, and the depth of the ocean basins and the heights of the mountaintops, those all post-flood. And so as Texas is coming up out of the floodwaters, what's happening? Water is draining off into the Gulf Coast, okay? And now some of the best gas plays and some of the best ocean oil and gas exploration is happening in the Whopper Sand, which is a really clean sand about 300 miles offshore, and there's no geological explanation for why it's there. It's in really, really deep water, and it's really, really clean sand, and nobody knows how it got there, except the young Earth creation geologists are all saying, excuse me, I know you think we're clowns, okay? And I think we don't know, we know that the Earth is not flat, but you can't tell me how the ocean sand got there, okay? And by the way, they're finding dinosaur fossils in deep ocean sands. One of the best preserved dinosaur fossils was taken out of ocean sand, and the scientific explanation was, well, it died and then it floated out into the ocean. And then its body sank and was buried slowly amongst all those scavengers and all those decomposers, and it was preserved. A better explanation was it got tipsy and fell off a cruise ship. But the best explanation is it died in a global catastrophe. Okay? I'm not going to have time to go into the Grand Canyon. As a geologist, I was embarrassed that I'd never been there. My wife took me there 2 years ago. It was grand. And the Grand Canyon, let me just say this. It is a mile of ocean dirt. And the secular explanation is that a long time ago there was an ocean there. Okay? But if the principle of uniformitarianism tells you that you have to use natural processes to explain what you see in the rock record, show me where there's an ocean in the middle of a continent today. That's a mile of ocean dirt in the middle of a continent. Okay? And then I was taught that the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon. It's a mile deep and over 7 miles wide in places, 15 in others. Okay? Have you seen the little river in the bottom of that? Okay? The river is there because the canyon captured it. It's a chicken and egg thing. The canyon is not there because the river carved it. The canyon was carved as the floodwaters were receding off of Arizona and Colorado and New Mexico. And by the way, all the sediment that came out of the Grand Canyon, you can still see today in Mexico. And by the way, there's more ocean dirt than just what's on the Grand Canyon. It's been eroded over time. If you plot the bottom sandstone layer in the Grand Canyon, look at that. Okay, I was taught that that was a beach sand. By the way, this guy right here, he's pointing to a piece of sand grain that's about the size of a Mack truck, okay? And it's well-rounded, so it means it's been tumbled. That's a big sand grain, okay? And I was taught that that was a beach. Look at the size of the beach. Can you imagine getting the hotel concession for that? Okay? What does that tell you? Is that a process that is occurring today? No. There are sands in the Grand Canyon that came from the Appalachian Mountains. Well, they just pack up their bags and say, I'm tired of being in Appalachia. I want to go to the Grand Canyon. No, it's continent scale catastrophe. This is crossbedding. That's my beautiful wife. She learned what a crossbed was when we went to the Grand Canyon. She could point one out. And I was taught in my secular geology that those are sand dunes, except there's seashells in them. No, those are giant ripples. Okay? Just beautiful. So, I didn't get it all into fossils, but Russ has blessed me with, I'm going to use hyperbole here, 1 million fish fossils, okay? Close to it. And all of those fossils died in the Green River Shale, basically kind of at the same time. It's a giant fish graveyard. So they all decided to die at the same time. And they're all wonderfully preserved because they were buried and they weren't scavenged, and they weren't decomposed. But folks, there are not fossils forming like that on the surface of the planet today. Why not? Because we had a planet-altering event that God gave us a record of, and when you factor that in, and you look at the world around you, and look at what God says he did in his text, and then use that as your glasses to interpret the world around you, everywhere you look, you see signs of a global flood. Don't miss the forest for the trees. We're not looking for a 6-foot silt layer, okay? We're looking at the scale of the Grand Canyon. So on my way over here, I crossed the Trinity River, and I got close to crossing the Brazos River. And both of those have floodplains that are huge compared to the little bitty rivers that are flowing now. Do you know why those rivers have huge floodplains? Because at one time, that was the last vestige of the drainage of the flood coming off of Texas. And the rivers flow there now because that's the lowest point. Those floodplains captured the rivers. The rivers did not make the floodplains. Evidence of the global flood on the way over here to come talk to you tonight. I could go on and on and on, and you guys are getting really hungry. So I was told I need to stop at 7:15. I'm going to open up the floor for questions after I pray and let everybody go, okay? Heavenly Father, thank you for giving us the text. You are sovereign, and you told us what you did and why you did it. You are a holy God, and you judge sin, and yet you display grace in the midst of your wrath. You saved 8 individuals and a bunch of land animals and birds as a picture of salvation you provide through our ark, Jesus Christ. Help us to approach your word and put ourselves in submission under its authority rather than putting that upside down. Thank you for making the world around us. Thank you for giving us brains that we can think intelligently. Thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn what you did and help us to take you at your word. Thank you for being the author and finisher of our faith. And help us to defend our faith in such a way that we bring people to you. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.